Welcome to the deep dive. And, we're brought to you, as always, by Ben's book summaries. Today, we're going deep, really deep into a book that's had, well, a huge impact on how we understand, you know, the story of us humans, Sapiens,
Mhm.
by Yuval Noah Harari. It's called A Brief History of Humankind. And it's become, well, kind of a must read for anyone wanting to grapple with where we came from, and how we got to, well, where we are.
It really has. It's like this sweeping epic, but also, incredibly insightful about the very specific things that make us human. So think of this deep dive as your express lane to the core of Sapiens, right? We're going to distill those big arguments, the aha
Mhm.
moments, and some of the most quoted ideas from the book, so you can really get it without needing weeks to actually read the whole thing.
Right. Because let's be honest, who has time for that these days? So we're all about knowledge that sticks, delivered efficiently, and that's what this deep dive is for. So let's jump right in. And Harari starts with something that, well, might seem kind of obvious, but it's actually a really profound shift in how we think about ourselves,
Mhm.
our place in the animal kingdom.
Yeah, it's like, we tend to think of ourselves as so separate, but he really brings it home that Homo sapiens is, well, just another member of the great ape family. We've got relatives, close ones. Chimpanzees, they're our nearest living kin. And when you think about it, it's only like 6 million years ago that we shared a common ancestor, a single female ape. Pretty mind-blowing when you put it that way.
It is. It really it kind of shrinks those perceived differences, right? So from there, the book looks at well, what sets us apart, what makes us special, and obviously our big brains come to mind, like more brain power, more success, right? That's the basic idea.
Well, it seems logical, yeah. But Harari asks this really interesting question. He says, if sheer brain size was like the key to evolutionary dominance, why don't we have like, super intelligent cats out there solving calculus problems? Like,
Mm.
why is it just us, the Homo genus, that made this huge cognitive leap? It makes you think twice about that whole, bigger brain, better species equation.
Definitely does. It's not that simple, right? Now, another huge development for our ancestors was mastering fire, and this wasn't just like a campfire thing. This was around 300,000 years ago, and it became like a fundamental part of life for several human species, including us.
Oh, absolutely. Fired. It was like a game changer, literally. Light, warmth, obviously essential, but it also became this tool for managing the environment. Early humans, they probably used fire to clear land, and that would encourage the growth of, certain grasses, which would attract game animals. And then, as Rory describes it, these Stone Age entrepreneurs, they'd come in and collect all the cooked remains, animals, nuts, roots. It was like early landscape design, managing resources.
So, with fire as this revolutionary force, what was it about sapiens that allowed them to, well, outcompete and even drive other human species to extinction, like
Yeah.
the Neanderthals, for example? What was our secret weapon?
I mean, the leading theory, and it's like a central point of the book, is our unique language.
Hmm.
It allowed us to communicate in this complex way, to share information quickly and efficiently, and that was the foundation of our dominance. Sapiens, they conquered the world, but it was primarily through words.
And this language, this ability to communicate, fueled what Harari calls the cognitive revolution. And this was a turning point around 70,000 years ago. And, these early sapiens, they looked like us physically, their brains were the same size, but something fundamental changed in how they thought, how they interacted.
Yeah, it wasn't like a sudden physical upgrade, right? It was a change in our cognitive abilities, like how we
Mm.
process information and how we share it with each other.
Yeah.
And this new way of thinking, this new way of communicating, it put us on a whole different path.
And one of the key outcomes of this cognitive leap was, well, gossip. Sounds kind of trivial, but Harari argues that it was crucial in forming those larger, more stable social groups. It's like, think about office politics today, right? It's all about these informal networks of information, and that goes all the way back to those early sapiens bands.
Exactly. And there's actually sociological research that suggests that groups that are like held together by, personal relationships and gossip, they tend to have a natural size limit of around 150 individuals.
Hmm.
Like below that, you can kind of maintain social order through, familiarity and reputation. You see this in like, small towns or even like close-knit teams at work.
But Sapiens, they managed to scale way beyond these small groups, right? So what was it that allowed us to cooperate so effectively with, huge numbers of strangers? This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this is where Harari brings in this idea of collective imagination and legal fictions. Like, think about a company like Peugeot, right? It's not a physical thing you can touch, but it exists legally. It owns property. It operates globally. It's a shared story, a product of our collective belief.
So we're living in this dual reality, as the book calls it, right? There's the physical world, and then there's this world of beliefs, of things like nations, religions, corporations, and it's amazing how much this imagined reality shapes the actual physical world. Think about the value of money, the laws of your country. All of these things are based on shared beliefs, but they don't actually physically exist.
It's true. And the crazy thing is, the fate of real rivers, real forests, can depend on decisions made by these intangible entities. And the power of these myths is that they can change. Harari gives this great example of France in 1789, where the whole idea of like the divine right of kings, it just vanished almost overnight, and it was replaced by this new belief in the sovereignty of the people.
And this rapid evolution of beliefs, it meant that cultural evolution was happening like at warp speed, way faster than, the slow crawl of genetic evolution. And this adaptability, our ability to cooperate on these huge scales, it gave sapiens this massive advantage.
Yeah, it's like while our bodies were changing slowly over, thousands of years, our societies could transform within generations just based on new ideas.
And the book suggests that archaic sapiens, they were probably trading information too, not just, like shells or flint. If they were exchanging those things, they were probably also sharing knowledge, creating these dense networks that were much more expensive than, what other human species had.
And this ability to collaborate, it extended to hunting too, and sapiens became incredibly effective at it. Harari contrasts the Neanderthals, who hunted in small groups, with sapiens, who relied on these large-scale coordinated efforts.
So how did they do that?
Well, they developed these sophisticated strategies, like encircling entire herds of animals and driving them into natural traps, or even building elaborate ones themselves. And this allowed them to, secure huge amounts of resources all at once, basically turning hunting grounds into, as Harari puts it, slaughterhouses.
Which I'm sure the Neanderthals noticed. Now, the book also dives into, a very relatable topic, why we modern humans tend to, crave and overeat those high-calorie foods, something I think we all struggle with.
It's so true. And the explanation, it goes back to our evolutionary past. Forager ancestors, they lived in environments where energy-rich foods were scarce. So when they found them, like, a bush full of ripe berries, the instinct was to eat as much as possible. And that gorging instinct, it's still hardwired into us, even though now, we're surrounded by calorie-dense food everywhere. That's why finishing off a whole pint of Ben& Jerry's can feel so natural.
Right. It's like our inner caveman is still in control. Okay, so that's a good overview of the cognitive revolution. Now let's move on to the next big upheaval, the agricultural revolution. But before we get there, Harari makes this really important point. Understanding the forager lifestyle, that whole period between the two revolutions, is crucial.
Yeah, he argues that it's an essential for understanding a lot of the debates we have today about things like sexuality, social structures, even political systems. But trying to understand forager life, it's tricky. We don't have written records. The archaeological evidence is, it's fragmented. A lot of the materials they used would decayed. And then, even the forager groups that survived into modern times, they've been influenced by agricultural societies.
Mm-hmm.
And the environments where modern foragers live, like, the Kalahari, they might not be representative of the richer territories that early sapiens lived in.
And to illustrate this point, the book talks about this 12,000-year-old tomb in Israel where they found the remains of a woman buried with a puppy. And it suggests this deep emotional bond between humans and animals even back then. But as the book says, there could be other interpretations. It's like a reminder that we're always working with incomplete information.
Yeah, it's a lot of educated guesswork in a way. But what we do know is that most sapiens bands during this period, they were nomadic, moving around based on the seasons and the availability of resources.
Mm-hmm.
And their diet. It was incredibly diverse and adaptable.
It's funny, we always think about man the hunter, but gathering, it actually made up, the majority of their food. They were foraging for everything from, insects and plants to bigger game animals.
They were like the ultimate omnivores, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about, finding food, this foraging. It was also about accumulating knowledge. Their survival depended on this deep understanding of their environment.
So what kind of knowledge are we talking about?
They needed like these intricate mental maps of their territory, detailed knowledge of um, plant and animal behavior, and all sorts of skills.
Hmm.
How to make tools, how to predict the weather. The average ancient forager, they had a level of environmental expertise that, most of us today, we can only dream of.
But, Harari doesn't romanticize forager life either. He also points to the harsh realities, right? Like he gives examples of infanticide and even the killing of the elderly in some groups. It's a reminder that that life back then, it was often brutal, and survival meant making some really tough choices.
And those examples, they really challenge that romantic image we sometimes have
Yeah.
of a peaceful, primitive past. It was anything but.
So what about their beliefs? Do we know anything about that?
Well, the book talks about the likelihood of animistic beliefs being prevalent among ancient foragers. And this wasn't necessarily a formal religion, but more like a way of seeing the world where there wasn't this strict hierarchy between humans and other beings, which is quite different from the theistic religions that became more common with agriculture. Although the book cautions against lumping all animism or all theism together because there was a lot of diversity within those categories.
Mhm. And did foragers experience violence? Was it, the peaceful existence that some people imagine?
Well, the archaeological evidence is it's mixed, actually. Some studies suggest that violence levels were relatively low in certain pre-agricultural societies compared to today. But then other sites show evidence of much higher rates of violent death, even comparable to like the 20th century. So it's complicated. It shows how much human societies varied throughout history.
That's not much we don't know.
Right, exactly. And Harari argues that that even though we don't have all the answers, it's still important to wrestle with these questions about forager life. We can't just dismiss 60,000 years of our history just because it's a bit mysterious.
Right. And he makes this really striking point that foragers actually had this huge impact on the planet even before agriculture. Like they were shaping landscapes, and they were, as he puts it, the most important and most destructive force the animal kingdom had ever produced.
That's quite a statement. And it leads us directly to, the consequences of that cognitive revolution. Sapiens, they were able to cross these geographical barriers, reaching Australia and the Americas, and the impact was, well, dramatic to say the least.
So what happened?
Well, this expansion led to the extinction of tons of unique plants and animals in these newly colonized continents. These creatures, they'd evolved in isolation for millions of years, and suddenly, here come sapiens. And the mass extinctions that followed, especially in Australia and America, Harari calls them swift and major ecological disasters. The megafauna, the large animals, they were hit especially hard. Like half of the planet's big beasts vanished relatively quickly after sapiens showed up. To give you a sense of the scale, around the time of the cognitive revolution, there were about 200 genera, that's different types of animals, of large land mammals weighing over 50 kilograms. But by the time the agricultural revolution rolled around, only about 100 were left. It really shows the ecological footprint that our species had, even in those early days.
And then comes the agricultural revolution, right? And then we often think of this as, progress, a step forward. But Harari, he calls this a fantasy. He even says it's history's biggest fraud. That's a pretty strong statement. What's so bad about farming?
Well, his argument is that that agriculture, it didn't actually make life easier like we tend to think. Instead, it led to harder work, less diverse diets, often less nutritious too, and then this huge population boom, which, put a strain on resources. And it also led to the rise of elites who benefited from everyone else's labor. It wasn't a good deal for most people.
He even suggests that that wheat, in a way, domesticated us rather than the other way around. Like we became slaves to its cultivation.
It's an interesting way to think about it, right? Because, think about all the work that goes into growing wheat, clearing land, tilling, weeding, protecting it from, pests, irrigating it. It's incredibly labor intensive. Think about what they had to do. Clear those fields of rocks, constantly weed, fight off pests and diseases, haul water, even collect animal dung to use as fertilizer. It took up a huge amount of time and energy.
And settling down, it did lead to bigger populations, but it also brought new problems, right?
Well, yeah, definitely. In forager societies, there were natural ways of spacing out births and keeping the population in check. But with agriculture, fertility went up because there was more food available and they could wean their babies earlier.
What?
And this led to, overcrowding, food shortages, and diseases spread much more easily in these denser settlements.
And then there's what the book calls the iron law of history, which is that luxuries, they tend to become necessities, and that creates all these new obligations and dependencies.
It's so true. Like, think about all the time-saving devices we have today.
Yeah.
Washing machines, computers, smartphones. They were supposed to, make our lives easier, give us more free time. But instead, we're often, busier than ever. And there's this pressure to be productive and connected all the time.
The technology trap. Right?
Exactly. And it's fascinating because Harari also talks about these monumental structures like Göbekli Tepe. And these were built by, forager societies long before agriculture. And they didn't have any obvious practical purpose.
So what were they for?
Well, it suggests that these forager groups, they had pretty complex religious or ideological systems, and they were capable of, large-scale cooperation. It challenges this idea that that complex social structures and beliefs only came about with settled agriculture. It shows that, forager life, it wasn't just about survival. They had rich cultural and spiritual lives, too.
So alongside agriculture, we also see the development of pastoralist societies, right, where people were mainly focused on raising and, well, exploiting animals. And the sheer number of domesticated animals today, it's mind-boggling.
Oh, it is. I mean, think about it. 10,000 years ago, there were only a few million sheep, cattle, pigs, chickens,
Yeah.
Today, there are billions. From a purely, genetic standpoint, if you measure success by the number of DNA copies, the agricultural revolution was like this huge win for these species.
But it wasn't exactly a picnic for the animals, right?
No, not at all. The book talks about the suffering they endured because of their subjugation, living in these unnatural conditions, like being confined to small spaces, having to wear bridles and harnesses, being controlled with whips, and, castration was widespread. All of this to serve human needs.
And for the peasants who were tied to the land by agriculture, life became much more focused on ensuring future security, which meant, constant anxiety about the harvest, the threat of famine, disease. It was a big shift from the maybe more present-oriented lifestyle of foragers.
It was. And this anxiety about the future, it laid the groundwork for the development of these large-scale political and social systems, although the book points out that the peasants themselves, they rarely, achieved any real economic security.
Right. It's like they were working harder, but not necessarily benefiting more.
Exactly.
And this transformation, it also paved the way for the emergence of what Harari calls imagined orders and social hierarchies. Like, he gives the example of Hammurabi's Code.
Yeah, Hammurabi's Code. It's a great illustration of an imagined order, It divides people into genders and social classes, each with different rights and responsibilities. And the idea that children could be treated as property, it really underscores this hierarchical structure.
And the book even offers this biological interpretation of, that famous phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Harari suggests that it might be more accurate to translate it as life and the pursuit of pleasure, which, makes you think about that whole concept of natural equality.
It does. And it brings us to this key point about these imagined orders. We follow them, not necessarily because they're, objectively true, but because believing in them allows us to cooperate on a large scale, to build complex societies. Like Hammurabi, he probably used the same kind of logic to justify his hierarchical system.
So how do you convince so many people to buy into these imagined orders?
Well, the trick, according to Harari, is to never admit that they're just, made up. You always present them as objective realities, like they're ordained by God, or they're just the natural order of things. Inequality, for example, is not just a social invention. It's presented as divinely mandated or, biologically determined.
And these powerful imagined orders, like, the idea of a nation, the value of money, human rights, they're all intersubjective, right? They exist because we all agree that they exist, and that makes them incredibly difficult to change.
Yeah, changing these deeply ingrained beliefs, it takes this this massive shift in collective consciousness.
Mm.
And that often happens through, large organizations like political movements or religious institutions. And they all rely on, shared narratives, shared myths to convince strangers to cooperate.
And as these empires grew, as these imagined orders became more complex, they eventually reached a point where, the human brain, it just couldn't handle all the information. And that's what led to the invention of writing.
And what's interesting is that, writing, it wasn't initially developed for like artistic expression or to, record history like we often think of it. It was much more practical. It was about storing and managing huge amounts of data, especially related to, taxes and administration.
It's like the first spreadsheets.
Exactly.
And the arrival of writing, it had this profound impact on how we think, right? Like it shifted us from this more fluid, associative way of thinking to a more structured, compartmentalized, bureaucratic way of processing information.
The book compares it to filing cabinets, which
Yeah.
are great for organizing information, but they fundamentally change how we think.
So these distinctions that emerged, free versus slave, rich versus poor, they're all ultimately based on these shared fictions, right? But throughout history, these hierarchies, they've always claimed to be, natural, inevitable, like Aristotle's idea of a slavish nature, for example.
Yeah, and the Indian caste system is a powerful example of that. It's a rigid social hierarchy
Yeah.
based on these fictional beliefs about purity and impurity, but it's presented as this fundamental aspect of cosmic reality, and that's how they justified these social divisions.
And this idea of pollution, it's been used to isolate and control all sorts of marginalized groups throughout history, right? And it might go back to these deep-seated biological mechanisms like, avoiding
It's
disease.
like a primal fear in a way.
And the book talks about the historical development of racial hierarchy in America and how the initial importation of African slaves, it was driven by economic factors, not necessarily this inherent belief in racial inferiority. But over time, this whole racist ideology was constructed to justify and perpetuate this system.
And it led to these vicious cycles where initial discrimination created the conditions that were then interpreted as evidence of inherent inferiority. And that just, reinforced the hierarchy, making it harder and harder to break free.
It's a powerful example of how, these social constructs, these inequalities, they can become so deeply embedded and they can last for generations, even centuries.
It's a sobering thought, really.
The book also offers this interesting perspective on, what we think of as natural biological developments. Like it points out how insect wings, they probably evolved gradually from structures that initially had totally different purposes, like, regulating temperature.
It's a reminder that that even what seems inherently natural, it might have these surprising contingent origins, and it's something to keep in mind when we think about concepts like biological sex and socially constructed gender.
Because as the book points out, there's this crucial distinction between biological sex, which is, the male-female binary based on chromosomes, and social gender, which is all about the culturally defined categories of man and woman and all the roles and rights and obligations that go with them. And Harari argues that gender, it's much more a reflection of human imagination than, pure biology.
And while patriarchy, the preference for male dominance, it's been remarkably widespread across different cultures throughout history, even before they had much contact with each other. The biological reasons for this, they're still not clear. It's a topic of debate.
And there are a lot of theories, right? Like, men's greater physical strengths, the link between warfare and male dominance. But the book questions, why these factors necessarily translate into male social dominance at all levels.
Yeah, it's like, historically, leadership positions, they haven't always been filled based on solely on physical strength. Things like, aristocracy, wealth, education, they've always played a role. And then there's the fact that that women are underrepresented in leadership despite their potential strengths in,
Yeah.
Negotiation and building consensus. It's a complex issue.
And there's the evolutionary argument too, right? That men might have evolved to be more ambitious, more competitive because of, the biological drive to compete for reproductive opportunities. But at the end of the day, the near universality of patriarchy, it's still a mystery.
And it speaks to this human capacity to hold these these contradictory beliefs. Like the book is the example of the medieval nobleman who could be like deeply pious, but also embrace the violent ideals of chivalry.
It's like we can hold two opposing ideas in our heads at the same time.
Exactly.
And this brings us to this fundamental tension within modern values, this conflict between the ideals of equality and individual freedom. And it's a struggle that's shaped political discourse and, history since the Enlightenment.
And it's still playing out today, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we balance these two values that are often, at odds with each other?
It's a constant negotiation. Now, taking a broader view, the book talks about how, throughout history, the number of distinct human worlds has shrunk dramatically. It's gone from this galaxy of isolated human worlds to this increasing interconnectedness.
Yeah, like the example of Tasmania is a good one.
Yeah.
They were isolated for like 12,000 years. It's hard to even imagine that level of separation.
It's wild. And the fact that, so many plants, animals, technology, they've only spread globally relatively recently. It shows how different the world was just a few centuries ago. Like, no tomatoes in Italy, no potatoes in Poland, or the Plains Indians, they only developed their horse culture after the arrival of Europeans.
It's like we take these things for granted, but they're actually relatively new additions to, certain parts of the world.
And what's interesting is that, alongside all the conflict, history also shows these surprising instances of cultural tolerance and exchange, like Harari talks about Muslim societies using Christian coins for trade.
Yeah, it's a reminder that interactions between different cultures, they haven't always been just about antagonism. There's been a lot of exchange and even cooperation throughout history.
And in hunter-gatherer societies, there was no money as we know it. Exchange was based on this system of favors and obligations within these small, close-knit groups.
There's an economy of favors and obligations, and it worked well in those small communities where everyone knew each other, and there was this social pressure to reciprocate.
But that system breaks down, when you have larger, more complex societies where people are interacting with strangers, and barter, it only goes so far, and that's what led to this huge mental revolution, the invention of money.
And money, it's not just, these physical objects like coins or banknotes. It's this powerful intersubjective reality. It's a shared belief system that creates trust and allows us to cooperate on a massive scale, exchanging all sorts of goods and services.
It's amazing how much our entire world is built on this shared fiction.
There really is.
And the rise of gold and silver as universal forms of money, it was driven by their portability, their durability, and the forces of supply and demand connecting these expanding trade networks.
But our relationship with money, it's a tricky one, right? It's this balancing act between, its ability to facilitate cooperation and the fear that it's going to corrupt our values, our relationships. Societies are constantly trying to, to build these communal dams to contain the influence of market forces.
It's like we need it, but we also fear it.
Exactly.
And alongside economic power, which is, represented by gold, the book also emphasizes the role of military might, which is, steel.
Yeah.
And this was crucial in the unification of humankind through empires.
And empires throughout history, they've often tried to legitimize their rule by, adopting and reinterpreting the histories and symbols of the cultures they conquered. Like, the Spanish patriots drawing on the legacy of Numantia, a Roman Catholic Church, incorporating local traditions.
It's about, creating this sense of continuity, right? And the book has this pretty broad definition of an empire. It's not just about, military conquest or autocratic leadership. It's more about cultural diversity and flexible borders. And he gives examples ranging from the Athenian League to the vast British Empire.
And what's interesting is that Harari argues that modern national identities, they're often more shaped by the imperial structures that people lived under than by ancient ancestral traditions. Like he gives the example of Jewish people under the Babylonian Empire, the development of the Talmud.
So it's like empires